Hi, everyone, and welcome. My name is Bhaskar Sankar, and I'm the editor and publisher of Jacobin magazine. And this is another edition of the Stay at Home series. This is actually what the Stay at Home series is really all about. We're getting to the core of how to understand and interpret the world so that we could change it. And today we are joined by Vivek Chibber, who is a professor of sociology at NYU. He's also the editor of our sister publication, Catalyst, a journal of theory and strategy. In addition to that, he's the author of two excellent books, Locked in Place, as well as Post-Colonial Theory and the Specter of Capital. And Vivek, a couple years ago, started working on a really great set of pamphlets. And three of them have already been produced, the ABCs of Capitalism. We released them already through the Jacobin store. They've been translated into well over a dozen languages. We will be reprinting them shortly. There's still a handful of copies available at the Jacobin store, but we'll be reprinting them shortly. And we'll also be releasing it in PDF form very soon. We were actually meant to do it around the holidays. We were slightly delayed, but it's going to be out there. We should have a Spanish version available in print later in the year, and also available for free via PDF. So this one is an unusual stay at home in that we're going to be doing three separate lectures. Each of them are going to be 30 minutes or so. Then after that, we're going to have a Q&A. If you have a question for Vivek, you could leave your comments on either Facebook or YouTube. Chances are I'm going to get to your question quicker if you're on the YouTube platform, just because it's going to be difficult for us to curate through both streams at the same time. But either way, please do leave your questions, and we'll do Q&A afterwards. The lecture that Vivek is doing is broken up into, like I said, three different parts. Today, his lecture will be called Understanding Capitalism, which will be based loosely on the first pamphlet of the ABCs of Capitalism. So without further ado, I'll let Vivek chat for about 30 minutes and give his lecture. And then after that, we'll have the Q&A. But thank you so much for giving us so many hours of your time, Vivek. And please go ahead, start whenever.
Thanks, Bhaskar. It's a very odd format, speaking into a screen. It's not something I've done before, and I wish I could see at least some faces, but I'm going to try to make the best of it. What we're trying to do in this series this week is get to the core of what a socialist, or more specifically a Marxist understanding of capitalism is. Because on the left, while there's obviously lots of moral outrage at what's going on in society, while there's a commitment to make society better, what you do to make society better, how you go about making it better, the strategy you deploy really doesn't come out of your moral outrage per se. It comes out of your concrete understanding of how this society works, how the institutions in it work, why people do what they do, and how it might be that you can move towards a system that provides better opportunities to people, that is more humane, etc. The question of justice cannot really be addressed without having some kind of political strategy. And a political strategy does not flow from your moral outrage at the system, but rather from your theoretical understanding of how it works and how people in that system go about doing what they do. So in the course of these three lectures, what I'm going to focus on is three different components of that theoretical understanding of capitalism, which more or less line up with the three pamphlets as they are organized. The first lecture today tries to get at the core attributes of what a capitalist system is. What makes it capitalist? Why it is that in this system you get injustice being systematically produced. Why it is that even though everyone knows that it's unjust, it's very hard to do anything about it. The second lecture will then say, okay, given that the society is unjust, given that its outcomes are ones that so many people find objectionable, how is it that the people on top, the people in power, are able to maintain their power? Why isn't it possible for people to simply overturn it and bring about something new. So the second lecture is essentially about power. And within that, particularly focusing on the state as the central institution in which that power is organized. The third lecture will then say, okay, having understood how people's interests are lined up, having understood why actors do what they do, and then having understood how power constellations and power centers defend the institutions producing injustice, then the third pamphlet will say, how do you go about changing it? And in particular, why do socialists focus on class as being the key site of organizing? And, on the left today, everyone thinks it's an arbitrary choice, like ice cream flavors or people's taste in clothes. And all kinds of terms have been invented to cast aspersion on socialists, class reductionism, class essentialism, all this kind of stuff. What we're going to do is to try to say, well, what is the rational basis for socialists to prioritize class, and try to offer a view that says this is nothing to be embarrassed about. People are embarrassed about it because they've lost touch with the people who they're trying to organize. And all debates within the left are occurring within quite elite circles where, of course, all talk of class is considered kind of vulgar and unsophisticated. We'll try to point out why it's actually the opposite is true. So those are the three lectures. What I want to do now then in this first lecture is lay out what a traditional socialist understanding of capitalist society is. And I say socialist rather than Marxist for the following reason. I've tried to get to the common core elements of what the working class movement has understood to be essential to Marxism. Essential to capitalism. Core elements that extend beyond simply the Marxist understanding of this. While Marxists, I think, will agree with most everything I have to say, what I'm laying out is also, I think, something that people coming out of other socialist traditions will also find pretty familiar and hopefully will agree to it. We want to try to see if it's possible to build an understanding of capitalism that encompasses as much of the left as possible and not narrow it down to one particular sect's understanding of what the system is. And as I go along, there are times when I'll highlight how what I'm saying might be construed in a narrow or a wide way and what the implications of that are. But the essential lines of demarcation that we want to focus on are not different traditions within the left. What we want to focus on is the lines of demarcation separating a socialist working class perspective from a neoliberal perspective and a kind of progressive liberal perspective. So essentially what we're laying out is how a working class anti-capitalist perspective differs from those that might even be kind of progressive within capitalism, but not necessarily anti-capitalist. That being said, the understanding of our society today can broadly be broken into three different approaches. So the first one is what we might call an atomistic approach, coming from an atomized view of society. This approach views social outcomes, like who does well and who doesn't do well, who's rich and who's poor. It views those outcomes as driven fundamentally by individuals and their properties, their particular properties. So winners and losers are decided by the attributes of individuals and not by anything in the world around them. It's summarized, I think, best in Margaret Thatcher's famous aphorism, roughly going like as, there's no such thing as society, there's only individuals. And what Thatcher was trying to say was, stop blaming this thing called society when you see poverty, or when you see misery, or when you see penury. Understand that all there is people going about their business, trying to do the best for themselves. And it follows from this that if outcomes are regrettable, if some people are rich and others are poor, if some people are doing well while others are suffering, it's objectionable, yes, but it's not due to flaws of social institutions, it's due to the flaws or the shortcomings of the individuals themselves. So don't blame society. Look at the people and look at how they're behaving as individuals. Okay, this, all of us know, is the kind of view that's propagated in the free market, kind of market fundamentalist ideology. And what is crucial to it is that if you hew to this view, then social critique and social transformation simply goes out the window. It's out of the question now to engage in it. What you engage in instead, when you seek to improve the world, is the individuals that inhabit the world. If you want to improve something, focus on the people, focus on individuals, their values, how hard they work, their intelligence, their endowments, all these sorts of things. So, in this view, in our society today, if there's plenty of people who are unhappy, then, as Herman Cain said in 2016 when he ran for president, he says, work harder, try harder, improve yourself, do better as an individual. Well, that's one view. The key to this view is to focus on individuals and their attributes. Now, this can be contrasted to what one might call a social view. Now, the social view, in terms of numbers, is most commonly associated with progressive liberal or liberalism. It differs from the atomistic or neoliberal view in that it sees social outcomes as driven primarily by social institutions and social structures. So if you see some people are rich and others are poor, some people are doing well and others are not, it is not because of the variations in properties of individuals, but it's because of the variations in the circumstances in which those individuals are embedded. This doesn't mean that individuals are irrelevant. It doesn't mean that there's no such thing as a lazy person or a person who has much greater abilities or a person who has much greater skills. What it says is, whatever variations in individuals there are, they're going to stretch across the rich and the poor. You'll find lazy people among the rich. You'll find lazy people among the poor. You'll find very well endowed people among the rich, people who are very athletic, people who are very, very fast, people who are very, very intelligent, and you'll find the same thing amongst the poor. It isn't the case that all the talented and all the hardworking people line up on one side. If there's poverty, it's because all of these individual attributes of the people in poverty are all the same. Those variations stretch across groups. What you do find is that circumstances in which the poor find themselves make it harder for them, militate against their ability to do what the neoliberals are asking them to do. Try harder on the market, get more skills for yourself. Progressive liberals say everybody wants to try hard. Everybody, in fact, who is poor typically works very hard. It's that they're on a treadmill. They're working hard, they're running as fast as they can, but their circumstances make it hard for them to advance themselves. So on this approach now, if outcomes are regrettable, it's because of the circumstances, the social institutions, and the structures in which people find themselves, not because of the individual. Now, of course, this means that the door to social critique now is opened. Now, the possibility of looking at social institutions and social structures becomes a reality. Well, you might say, well, okay, this sounds a lot like what socialists say, but it isn't quite. There is a subset of the social approach to social evils, which socialists inhabit and which makes them different from progressive liberals. And this is that for socialists, it's not just that people's circumstances differ and that the circumstances in which the poor find themselves militate against their improving their situation. But more specifically, it's that the social institutions and social structures are such that they pit people against each other so that the people who are rich don't just have a better situation for themselves, but in fact have different interests than the poor. This means that the rich and the poor are locked in a certain kind of social relation. It's not just that their circumstances are different. Their circumstances drive them together and lock them into a particular kind of relation with each other. Now, there are two aspects of these relations here that are especially important. First of all, the rich and the poor are in conflict with one another. Unlike the progressive liberals who don't see any necessary conflict between the rich and the poor, you can propose solutions in which everybody's benefiting and the rich have no particular reason to oppose them. In the socialist tradition, the recognition is, in fact, the groups into which people are divided make it so that they have different interests and indeed conflicting interests. Now, that's point number one. Point number two is that it's not just that people have different interests relative to each other, but that they also have different degrees of power. And this is the kicker. Because if the rich have different interests than the poor, and if they have equal endowments of power, okay, well, it's kind of like a civil war. You don't know who's going to come out on top. The poor might actually win all the time. But if the rich actually have more power than the poor, then it means that they're able to use that power to defend all the privileges that they have. And in fact, they use that power at the expense of the poor. So whereas Marxists or socialists agree with liberals that it is society, you do blame society, you do look at people's social circumstances. What they also predict, unlike the liberals, is that as long as you're in capitalism, the wealthy are going to defend that privilege, defend their position, and indeed maintain their greater advantages at the expense of the poor. And this has several very important implications. First of all, the implication is there's no such thing as a community. There's no social community or political community that stretches across classes. What there is different classes with different interests which are going to be in conflict. Secondly, it means that on many issues, whether you're trying to raise your wages, improve your working conditions, get better healthcare for everybody, improve the housing situation of the poor, what you're going to find is not just that you have to gather up the economic resources to do it, which is hard, but you're going to find that the people on top will resist these reform efforts. That's the conflict that the liberals tend to ignore and socialists will always focus on. And which leads to the final conclusion, the really important one, that while capitalism puts people into different classes and differently endows those classes, it means that and because the rich expend a lot of energy defending the greater wealth and the greater privilege that they have. Another way of saying that is that the rich militate, or rather the rich try hard to reproduce the very injustices that progressive liberals and socialists rail against. Or in other words, a capitalist society systematically produces injustice. It systematically produces injustice. The important point about this is it means that if you're committed to social justice, you have to train your focus on the properties of capitalism itself and not just institutional tweaks within it. It leads to the conclusion that a fight for social justice at its core is going to have to go up against essential properties of capitalism itself, not just of parties, a particular party, not just of particular individuals, not just of this or that institution, but the system itself not only produces wealth inequality, it also makes it reasonable, rational, and desirable for those people who are on top to keep in place all of those different aspects of social misery. Capitalism, therefore, is not compatible with a just society. This is now what I think is at the core of the Marxist and the wider socialist view, and what I would like to get into a little bit more deeply today. So let's start with a core idea that people are in different classes and that their class position determines their power and their interests. All right, so let's focus on that. All right, so what is the essence of a capitalist economy? There's no controversy over this. Neoliberals, liberals, socialists all agree. The essence of capitalism is you've got to produce for the market. People don't produce for themselves, for their own consumption. They produce to sell on the market. And the production that's carried out for the market is done in enterprises that are privately owned. They're employers, they're capitalists who own the enterprises and who hire in labor. That is, they hire wage labor. That wage labor, under the direction of the employer, produces the goods that are sold on the market. Okay, this is the modal description of what a capitalist economy is. Yes, within that, there's also people who own what's called who are middle class, who own their own enterprise, don't hire wage labor. There's very small businesses, there's large businesses, people who produce for themselves. All that's there. But the dynamic of the system, its essential thrust, is set by the capital-labor relationship, which is brought together in private enterprises that are trying to sell their goods. Everybody agrees on this. All right. We also understand that these products, in that they're sold on the market, meet or come up against certain constraints. Again, these aren't controversial. Let me mention two such constraints that are absolutely crucial. The first, of course, is that any capitalist, unless he's really, really lucky, any capitalist who goes to the market to try to sell a good finds that he's not the only one doing it. He's going to have to come up against competition. And in meeting that competition, he has to figure out a way of making his products attractive to the customers relative to the products that are being sold by others. There are going to be others who are selling exactly what he's selling, shoes, for example. And then there's going to be others who are selling different goods, who are saying to the customer, don't buy these shoes, you don't need them, come buy what we're selling, maybe shirts or something like that. So every capitalist, unless he's really lucky and finds a monopoly for himself, has to face competition. Competition is the driving force of the system. Again, everybody agrees on this. The second aspect, the second constraint which the capitalist has to face comes directly from the competitive constraint. Because you're trying to attract people to your own good, the primary way in which you do so is by making your goods cheaper. How do you make them cheaper? Well, you can make them cheaper by selling them at as low a cost as possible. But if all you do is sell at the lowest cost possible, you're also, bleeding your own profits. The only way you can reduce your selling price without also eating into your profits is by also reducing your costs, your inputs, whatever you pay out. Every capitalist pays out to buy his inputs and then sets a price that'll bring him the profit margin that he desires. In order to maintain the profit margin, if he's driving down the selling cost, the selling price, he also has to drive down his costs. Okay. From this then, again, all this is pretty uncontroversial. It's the implications that socialists attend to which makes it controversial. The key implication, which is the absolute essence of the system, is this. Because of their unrelenting focus on the bottom line, on cost reduction, capitalists have to economize on all their inputs. They have to economize on all their inputs. What this means is not just that they have to buy their raw materials, get their wage costs down, get all their overhead and drive it down as much as possible, but also that they have to extract maximum value out of whatever they're spending their money on. Everybody understands that an employer, a capitalist, wants to pay out as little as possible. But it's important to remember, he also wants to, for whatever he's buying on the market, extract the maximum value. He doesn't, for example, if he's buying machinery, he doesn't want to buy junk. You can buy junk really cheap. What he wants to buy is the best machines that he can get at the lowest price. Similarly, now, and this is where the rubber hits the road, with labor. First of all, a capitalist is going to want to pay out as little as possible in his wages. Now, this is important because what it means is every capitalist makes it his business because of his competitive constraint to suppress wages. Now, suppressing wages means something very specific. It's not that every capitalist pays the minimum wage or below the minimum wage. It's that every capitalist pays out as little as he can get away with. In some sectors that allow him to pay at or even below the minimum wage, at or below starvation wages, if he can get away with it. But there's also other sectors in which he's going to have to pay pretty handsomely relative to what his peers are paying out in these, let's say, to farm workers or to fast food workers. He's going to have to pay out a lot more if he's in the auto industry, which requires more skilled workers. If he's a software producer, in which he has to hire engineers. So of course, wage levels can be quite different across a capitalist economy. What makes them all, however, share one very essential attribute, owing to the competitive constraint, is whichever sector they're in that sector, they will always try to suppress the wages to whatever they can get away with, right? So that drive extends across all sectors, even though the outcomes aren't exactly the same. Similarly, it means if working conditions require, if improving the work conditions requires putting in a lot of money, paying for less hazardous working conditions, paying for better machines. He's going to try to ignore that because that is also impinging on his bottom line. So these are pretty familiar. Now, as for extracting the value, how is he going to do that? While he's paying out as little as possible, it means he's going to try to get as much work out of his labor as possible, making them work harder, making them work faster, and where it makes sense, making them work longer. Now, if described in a neutral way, anybody who defends a market society will agree with all this. What they refuse to understand, what they refuse to recognize, however, is that if capitalists are in fact extracting the maximum value out of their inputs in this fashion, it necessarily means that every employer is constantly going to be at war with his own employees. Because when he's suppressing their wages, he is, of course, suppressing their standards of living. And if he's suppressing their standards of living, if they're minimally rational, they're going to fight against it. If he's ignoring their working conditions, he's in fact making it more dangerous for them to work where they are, which means, in fact, they're going to try to work against it. If he is increasing the pace of work, making them work harder and longer, it is affecting their welfare, and they're going to try to do something about it. There is a constant, therefore, onslaught from capitalists against their own workers. It follows from this that whatever wealth they're getting for themselves, whatever riches the employers are making for themselves, is coming at the expense of the poor. And this is where the difference between progressive liberals and socialists come to a head. What this means is that it's not just the fact that the rich are doing better than the poor. It's that they're doing better because the poor are poor. It's that they're doing better because the poor are in the circumstances that they are. And insofar as their employees try to improve their circumstances, raise their wages, improve their working conditions, reduce the pace of work, it will come up against the resistance of their employer. Necessarily, it'll come up against the resistance. So now, look what we've done. We've derived that employers and employees, even though they're all in the market, even though they're all selling something on the market, face different constraints. Employers face the constraint of maximizing their whatever they're extracting from their inputs. Employees face the constraint that they have to hold on to their job while somebody's waging war on them. We've derived that employers have different interests than the employees, that in order to maintain their profits, they have to, in fact, suppress those very elements that go into the well-being, the standards of living of their employees. Now comes the final question. Why do the employees put up with it? The neoliberal answer is, oh, they don't have to. You don't like a job, quit. And that's true. It is true that you can quit your job. The kicker, though, is this. Neoliberals assume that anybody who quits their job can effortlessly and costlessly find a new job. First of all, that is obviously wrong. Any empirical study of capitalist labor market shows that quitting the job, all of the costs that go towards finding a new job, and they're considerable, are incurred by the employees. That there is no guarantee, even in many circumstances, not even a very high likelihood that you'll find a new job. Secondly, even if you do find a new job, the power imbalance between employer and employee is going to remain. Employers always have the option of kicking out, firing labor. Employees do not have the option of firing their boss. And because the boss has wealth to begin with, even if he loses all of his employees, even if they all walk out, he probably usually still has enough wealth, enough savings to last months, even years. Employees in the United States, 60% of households in the US don't even have $400 in the bank. How are they going to survive a week without work? Forget about a month. How will they even survive a week unless there's a powerful welfare state behind it? There's a massive, therefore, inequality in the exit options of employers and employees. So even if you find a new job as an employee, you're going to be in that same power imbalance that you were before. There might be a difference in the degree of that power imbalance, and there might be a difference in how that employer treats you. Maybe he's not as maniacal as the first one. Maybe he doesn't give as horrible work contracts as the first one, but the basic imbalance remains. So when you ask then, why do employees put up with this? The answer is typically because they have no other choice. Even if they move from one job to the other, in the labor market that they find, conditions will tend to be more or less the same. And whatever variation there is in the conditions, the one constant is going to be the imbalance between employer and employee, where the employee is in a position of weakness. Now, this has enormous implications, as we can see. What it's saying is, first of all, the employees are relative to the employers in a much worse social situation. It means that those employees not only are in a worse situation, they are in the situation they are because they're employees, because they're in the position of having to put themselves at the mercy of an employer. Thirdly, that the employer systematically blocks them or impedes their ability to improve the working conditions and the wages. And from this, it follows that the employer, in order to maintain his position in society, must maintain the injustice that is meted out to his employees. The position of the employer, the position of the capitalist, depends on reproducing injustice. And because he's more well endowed, typically it's going to mean he's going to be able to maintain that injustice. It used to be thought, so let me finish. This means then that for employees, for the working class, to improve its situation, it cannot rely on the market. The market is, in fact, the very institution that maintains the inequalities and the misery that is motivating him to improve his lot in the first place. The only way to do it is to change the rules of the game within the market, even if he wants to improve it within capitalism. And the main such mechanism is to not bargain with his employer atomistically as an individual, but the main such mechanism is to do it collectively so that the costs imposed on the employer, should he choose to ignore the demands, should he choose to punish the employee, the cost that he has to bear become greater. It's easy to fire one person. It's easy to fire 3 people. It's a lot harder to fire everybody who's in your employment venue, whether it's 10, whether it's 100, or whether it's 1,000. The main mechanism for employees, therefore, to improve their situation has been to go against the spontaneous rules of the labor market, which encourage everyone to bargain one-on-one, and instead to try to bargain collectively. And indeed, it is only with the emergence of the trade union movement that you have seen any ability on the part of the poor to improve their lot. The most dramatic example of this in the United States has been the experience of the past 50 years. It used to be thought, even by many on the left, whatever the flaws of capitalism might be, as long as the economy is growing, as long as productivity is going up, it does have a tendency to lift all boats. What we've seen over the past 50 years, this graphic shows, is that in fact it's not true. Since the mid-70s, productivity, which is how much additional wealth, additional income the employers are producing, has continued to go up at a pretty healthy pace. But what you've seen is, since the mid-70s, the wages of the employees who are generating that new wealth, who are generating that new income, have not gone along with it. They've in fact stagnated. And what you've gotten is, instead of 2 lines moving together, it's more like an alligator mouth, with one side, the top of the mouth, wide open, and the bottom of the mouth actually staying quite flat. Now, this is also the very era in which the most important institution for improving the working conditions, the wages, and the lot of the working class largely disappeared, and that was trade unions. Other things have happened, and we don't want to discount their importance. Globalization, increased automation, all that has happened. But there's no denying the fact and even now mainstream economists are coming around to this, that without the utter decimation of the trade union movement, the trends in wages would have been a lot better than what we've actually seen. Had the trade union movement managed to maintain itself, employees would have been in a position to bargain for themselves a greater remuneration, greater benefit for the work that they were putting in. So there's no doubt, it follows, that the only way out within a capitalist economy for the working class is minimally to not play by the rules of the market and to organize themselves as a class and fight for better working conditions and better wages for themselves. This is what the left has taught to the rest of society. Trade unions and other institutions of the working class are the most reliable means for their advancement. I guess once you admit this, what you've also admitted is that the market cannot solve the situation of the vast majority of the people. And once you've seen that it takes something like trade unions, you also observe how employers respond to trade unions, which is everywhere and always with hostility. You also recognize that the liberal myth of a national community, a political community, has to be abandoned. Forget the neoliberal myth of atomism. Even the progressive liberal idea of a positive sum game in which social reforms benefit everybody and no one has a reason to fight against them, that has to be abandoned. Which means, therefore, even progressive liberals, if they're true to their beliefs, have to come around to the view that unless you organize the poor, unless you bring them together as a class, you can't even make advancements within capitalism. Forget about overthrowing it. If all this is true, then it generates a quite different view of politics, even reform politics in capitalism, than what the mainstream view is. If all this is true, then it follows that the only way to improve lives, even within capitalism, is not just through better candidates, through electing better parties. It's not just through finding more reliable and more trustworthy individuals. It's not by appealing to the better instincts of the wealthy. The only way it comes about is through the fighting ability, the collective political mobilizational organizing activity of the poor. That's what socialists have been arguing now for a century. It comes directly from this understanding of society, much of which is totally uncontroversial. The premises are uncontroversial. It's the conclusions, which I think follow virtually deductively from the premises that liberals try so hard to avoid, and which is why, of the two sides, liberals and socialists, what a folly it is to think it's socialists who are ideological. The side of the intelligentsia that is bathed in ideology is the progressive liberals, because they cannot accept the conclusions of their own understanding of that society. Well, that's a separate question. The main thing for us is the commitment to organizing, to class struggle, the view of the strategy that this embodies comes out of the understanding of society I've laid out, in which A, people are organized into classes, B, the classes are differentially endowed, C, they have different interests, and D, social advancement for the poor comes through fighting for those interests, not simply appealing on their behalf. I'll stop there, Bhaskar.
That was great. Thank you, Vivek. Just reminded everyone that Vivek is also going to be doing lectures on Wednesday at 6 p.m. and on Friday at 6 p.m. I promise that before the lecture at 6 p.m., we're going to get a slightly revised, a few corrections here and there, version of the ABCs of capitalism that everyone can download for free and spread far and wide. We already have a lot of questions, so I think I'll just dive right into it. There was a couple compliments on your buzz cut, Vivek.
Yeah.
Did you do that yourself?
If we have time, I'll tell you.
But hey, I did one myself too. I have no idea what the back looks like.
It wasn't supposed to be this short, but I didn't know how to use the clippers. So once the initial after the initial path cut like a lawnmower path in my head, I had to make the rest.
You had to commit. You had to commit. Okay, so let me just get to some of these questions. I'm gonna take it in orders. The questions are all interesting. They're very different. So my apologies if it doesn't seem to follow a chronological sequence. Um, but let's see. There's one question about whether you could expound a bit on the existence of markets in pre-capitalist economies, or perhaps what markets would look like after capitalism in a socialist economy. So I guess maybe the distinction would be useful between market dependence and just the existence of markets. So why don't you start with that?
Did you say that the question was worried that I was confounding
No. It wasn't.
markets?
It wasn't a worry. Just about whether you could just discuss the existence of markets in
Sure.
pre-capitalist economies, and also potentially what role would markets have under socialism, and how that computes with a idea that that uh, production for markets is a distinguishing characteristic of capitalism.
Right. It's a good, and it's a very common question. Let's start with the pre-capitalist setting. Markets are not unique to capitalism. So if you simply define markets as a place where things are exchanged, trade and exchange has been around about as long as settled agriculture was around. The idea of something called a natural community, or these self-reliant agricultural communities, if it's understood to be a community in which there is no trade, does not seem to have any warrant whatsoever. There's always been trade, and there's always been markets. By always, I mean as soon as people were able to have some kind of surplus, and even in many, we've seen through excavations and archaeology, even in societies where there was almost no surplus, there was still trade. So the very existence of a market is itself not to be equated with capitalism unless you define it that way, which is how neoliberals do it. If you have any market, any exchange, you've got an incipient capitalism. All right, you can define things however you want. If you want to define capitalism that way, fine. But what Marx thought, and I know some people are going to say, well, no, Marx didn't think this because, well, he did, so live with it. What Marx thought was that it's when the market becomes the defining institution of the economy that you get capitalism. And let me explain what that means. You can have a market activity where people are every now and then exchanging things for themselves, but their actual economic existence doesn't depend on sales for the market. All the way up to the early modern period in Europe and 19th, 20th century outside of Europe, you did not have a situation where people who were exchanging depended for that exchange for their lives. It simply was not the case. You even had wage labor in pre-capitalist societies all over the place. You can find wage labor anywhere. Ancient Rome, even prior to that. But only a tiny section of society depended on their wages for their livelihood. The wage labor was usually a side activity that they did. So all this market activity, whether it's wage labor or whether it's selling on the market, was typically a side activity. Only a tiny proportion of society actually depended on it. What you get with capitalism for the first time is that the economic enterprise itself, if it doesn't successfully sell in the market, it vanishes, it dies. That wasn't the case before. So market participation needs to be distinguished from market dependence. That's what is unique to capitalism. All right, well, what about markets and post-capitalism? Well, I don't want to legislate on this. I don't want to pronounce on it because it's a live debate within the left. There's been two positions. One is the task of the left is to wipe out markets. So post-capitalist society is supposed to be a society in which everything is produced according to a plan and not the vagaries, not the uncertainty of the market. So that's one view. My view is that just as we can acknowledge that it's possible to have markets without having capitalism historically up till now, so too, after capitalism, it follows that you can have a market without that market having the properties of a capitalist market. It can be a non-capitalist market. Now, in my view, That's a good thing because I happen to believe that a fully planned economy is nothing but a pipe dream. I happen to believe that. I might be wrong, right? It's not a conviction. It's not an ideological belief. I just don't have any evidence that it could actually work. So in my view, some kind of market participation could happen in socialism, and it could happen without socialism degenerating or collapsing into capitalism if the appropriate institutional mechanisms are put in place.
Markets playing a role, but no more market dependence. If you
Yeah.
could still exit and you could subsist on decommodified goods, then you aren't market dependent in the way you are under capitalism.
And it's not just that the wage laborers will have at least partially decommodified participation in the market, but enterprises might also be partially decommodified. You have to remember there's two actors here. There's wage laborers and the enterprises as well. And there's different degrees to which you'll commodify them, and there'll be different ways in which ownership is exercised as well.
So let's get to a somewhat easier question, but this is a common argument that we get from libertarians. So someone is asking for a counter to the argument. Doesn't the capitalist attempt to suppress workers' standard of living get counterbalanced by workers' ability to choose which capitalists they work for? So
Well, I already addressed that. No, absolutely not. Imagine a junkie walking into an alley where there's 5 pushers. He can go from one pusher to the other. Every single one of them is going to have the power to ruin his life because he's so desperate for what the pusher needs. The fact that you can move from one bully to another doesn't mean they're not bullies. That's a very simple logical fallacy.
Right, and also worker starve that would still be your choice. It doesn't matter whether you could choose where
that's my point.
Where to starve.
Yeah, exactly. That the choice given to every worker, regardless of which employer he goes to, is do what I say or get the hell out. Unless the worker has a plot of land or his own factory that he can work himself waiting for him, the only choice he has is to find another employer. And that employer is going to try to maximize profits because he has to maximize profits to stay in the market, which means he is not ever going to give half of everything that's earned to the worker, all of his employees, while sharing with them on equal terms. Never. It's just never going to happen because he wouldn't be in the game if that's what the game was. He'd just go be a worker.
So
it's such a fantasy that you have to be fundamentally ideological to go on with it. And I have never met a libertarian who was able to hold his argument here. Never, not one. I don't even know how they exist.
So libertarians exist because they have great think tanks and they just push I think Connor Kilpatrick once described them as the equivalent of a mullet, or a cool kid ponytail from the 80s. It's, a party in the back, but all business up front. So there's another question which I think is easily rebutted along those same lines.
Why don't you give me some harder ones then? You're just giving me the ones that are easily rebutted.
Well, okay. One is just I think also a common one, right? Which is that the question of exit, right? Some workers can always work for themselves or start a new business or whatnot. So the condition of being a worker is just temporary. But the obvious response to that, along the lines of what you were just saying, is that that's an individual exit. It's not a resolution of the problem of class.
The fact that some prisoners can escape from prison doesn't mean that the prison doesn't exist. Again, it's just a logical fallacy.
Vivek Chibber comes out for prison abolition. That will be the clip of my this section on YouTube. I'm gonna make some clips after. All right. So let's see. Here's a question. Does Chibber think state managers form a class position distinct from workers and capitalists? After all, they pursue different economic strategies with different interests.
No, I don't. It's a good question. It's an interesting question. I don't think they're a distinct class per se from these two. They are a stratum. They are a distinct stratum. And you cannot predict what the stratum's economic orientation is going to be. And let me say why. First of all, the mere fact that state managers act in their own interests doesn't mean that they are a distinct class. Their interests, I'll get into this on Wednesday. State managers' interests in a typically capitalist setting are to, in fact, attach themselves and subordinate themselves to capitalism. So while they are not themselves capitalists, and in that sense have identifiable and somewhat distinct interests, the rational course of action for them is never to go up against capital. It's to subordinate themselves in some way to capital. Now that's a kind of the story of a modal capitalist state. Now, it is in fact true that in many situations, state managers are also themselves capitalists. This is especially true in the developing world. A country like Pakistan or Egypt or some of the other Ba'athist regimes in the Middle East, these are countries in which anywhere from 20 to 40% of the country's productive wealth is owned by the state. And where the people running the state are the military, it means that either the military or civilians who are running the state are directly themselves capitalists. But notice it's a very special condition there. It's the fact that the state is in possession of the means of production and thereby qualifies as a capitalist the way any other individual would. But simply by means, by virtue of being at the helm of a state, doesn't make you a different class than the other classes that we see in the state in the capitalist structure. You will end up being either a professional member of the middle class, or you'll end up being closer to a capitalist, or you'll end up simply being a civil servant that's a wage laborer. State managers tend to fall into the other classes, even though the institutional properties of the state makes them follow quite distinct economic or institutional logics.
All right, here's another question. How does
I hope that made sense.
Yeah, no, I think that made perfect sense. And you would admire my restraint for not getting into a follow-up question about the class nature of the Soviet Union. I will leave that debate in the past, leave them for our Trotskyist youth, and we will move forward with a different question.
Just to be fair, that's not the same question, because this question was about the state and capitalism.
Yeah, that is true, though. I think when you get to the question of let's say, Egyptian army officials overseeing state enterprises and whatnot, there is an interesting questions about the nature of a class versus, let's say, like a caste, like whether those state managers can reproduce themselves the way capitalists can reproduce themselves as a class. But anyway, I agree. It's not that interesting. But what is an interesting question is one that came up early on, which is, how does Chibber view the relation between capitalists and finance? Does he think the distinction between industrial versus financial capital or capitalist versus rentier is relevant today?
Yeah, it's always been relevant. Different segments or different factions of capital have always had quite distinctive interests, and sometimes those interests are at loggerheads. So it's a myth, it's a fallacy to think that the possibility or the potential for manufacturing interests to be resentful of the reign of finance, the dominance of finance, or for financial interests to rip off manufacturing interests and thereby to benefit at their expense, that all this is something peculiar to the post-1980s. It was actually going on all the time in the 19th century and into the early 20th century as well. There were a lot of Marxists in the early 20th century who spent all their time railing against finance capital because they thought finance capital is what's driving the global capitalist economy into the ground. So there's no doubt that the potential for conflict is there. And I think you can make a case that today there's plenty of room for conflict between them as well. In my view, however, I think whatever conflict there is between them has been vastly exaggerated by the left. As long as there is no challenge from labor, as long as there is no reformist impulse, these guys are going to be fighting over the social surplus because they are dividing the social surplus between them. But everywhere where we've seen the labor movement gain any kind of traction, they've come together faster than you can blink. And furthermore, there's a view out there that neoliberalism represents the political hegemony of finance, which shoved all these new deregulatory institutions and financial markets down the throats of the manufacturing sector. I don't think that's true. The turn towards finance, when it came in the 80s and 90s, there was no rebellion from manufacturing. There was not much of a peak, in fact, from manufacturing. Manufacturing played along. And I think there's many ways in which manufacturing has benefited from neoliberalism and adapted to it very rapidly. So I would be careful about political strategies depending on some putative conflict between manufacturing and finance. Whatever conflict there is pales in significance to the conflict between capital as a whole and labor.
Yeah, and a big titan of American industry, GE, became a big titan of American finance just because they were pursuing not their narrow sectoral interests or whatever else. They were just pursuing profits and money wherever they could
Right,
find
and
it.
that's what I mean about adapting to it. They don't have any problem as long as as long as the profits are rolling, and they're happy to play both sides.
So there's a question that came in. How does capitalism work when the market has been carved up into just a few firms and there's not much competition? So I guess this is a big umbrella for a few questions that came in about monopoly.
Yeah, capitalism often has either periods in which competitive intensity abates and goes down, and and in any period, there are sectors of the economy where a few firms might be dominating, even while competition is really the norm outside in other sectors of the economy. So a tendency towards monopolization has always exists. And there are periods, as I said, in which monopolization starts to really take over key sectors of the economy. There's a lot of evidence that that is happening today. Certainly in media, in information technology, even in some parts of the manufacturing sector, it seems to be the case that firms are not only becoming fewer in number, but their profit margins are expanding more rapidly than you would expect in a competitive market. So that's absolutely possible. Now, how is it the case that that means we are in monopoly capitalism? It's possible. Anything can happen. And maybe the capitalism today is morphing into something that we've never seen before. We should be cautious, though, of rendering or drawing such conclusions. The arguments for monopoly started to come around, as you all know, in the early 20th century. And that was a time when you saw cartels, trusts, very small numbers of enterprises taking over the economy. And empirically, it seemed to be the case that the system was changing, but it didn't last. You got a very rapid movement into a hyper-competitive economy very quickly. In the 50s and 60s, there was a lot of talk about monopolies taking over, and again, it didn't last. So I'm hesitant, and if I had to predict, for what it's worth, I would predict that you're going to see the entry of new players into the economy, restoring competition, or you're going to see a regulatory thrust which reduces the power of these monopolies, which again makes it possible for new entrants to come into the market again. It's very hard to sustain monopolies in capitalism without artificial state-backed barriers being set up. It just hasn't happened yet. Maybe it'll happen. Maybe we'll see it for the first time. But we should be appreciative of all the trends in the past when it seemed like it was happening and it didn't last.
Right, which is why when a progressive comes around like Elizabeth Warren, whose primary argument seems to be about trust busting or whatnot, as opposed to building up the power of workers or whatever else, we should be, one reason why we should be skeptical about
I mean,
how much it'll actually help
anytime you can
workers.
break up large corporations, look, anytime you attack the sanctity of property, it's a good thing. So, in and of itself, no problem against it. The problem is when you see that as the solution, as a technical fix to the problems, rather than the building up of class power. So, if you break up the monopolies, you still have a lot of large, very powerful firms doing all the things capitalists do. That's no panacea for the rest of the population.
And in effect, under a social democracy, though, we would institute policies that might favor larger term firms indirectly, and that they might be the only ones able to cope with certain wage demands coming out of centralized bargaining or something else.
Yeah, as long as you're in capitalism, It's not the case that what you want is millions of ma and pa shops and no large corporations. If as long as you're in capitalism, you want to be able to take whatever benefits capitalism generates. One such benefit is, increasing productivity, short of destroying the planet, of course. You want to take that benefit and you want to then make it flow towards the employees. And that is perfectly consistent with tolerating large enterprises as long as you can discipline them in the appropriate way.
This is a Vivek Chibber case against bodegas. But all right, here's one question. How can we be sure that the decoupling of labor income growth from productivity growth is caused primarily by the decline of unions and not by other factors like higher unemployment rates, international trade, technical change, etc.?
Well, it's an empirical question, and so like any empirical question, you should be cautious about your conclusions, and you should look at the facts. Let me just say at the outset, give you why I believe the unions played a crucial, if not exclusive, role in this. First of all, the dates line up pretty well with the decline of the union movement. So, mid 70s to late 70s is when the employer offensive really starts up against employees, and the unions, even where they're organized, start adapting a very concessionary strategy. So it lines up pretty well. It doesn't line up well with the globalization argument, because all the way into the mid to late 80s, the United States, if you look at its combined, what's called its exposure to trade, that is the combined contribution of exports and imports as a proportion of GDP, it's my memory is it's between 5 and 7%, which is very small. It's orders of magnitude less than a Sweden or a Norway or even a Germany. It's very small. The automation argument doesn't really line up either, because automation has gone in spurts in the 30s, in the 50s again, and in the 90s again. So the 70s didn't stand out as a period when it suddenly accelerated so that wages would be declining. As for unemployment in the 70s was probably greater than the 80s, but less than the 50s and 60s. All of these things contributed, but none of the other factors would have been so powerful as to sideline or minimize the importance of union. I think your point is well taken that other factors contributed to this. And I would not in any way deny that. I do, however, believe that the appropriate counterfactual is not, was it the unions because of which all this happened? But the appropriate counterfactual is, had the union movement still been around and sustained itself, would the outcome have been significantly different than what we saw? There's no doubt it would have been significant. I don't think so.
So there's a comment from Facebook, which is, in general, the Facebook comments are surprisingly, far more cordial. Instead of like, "Hey Chibber, did you shave your head?" It's "Hello Professor." So "Hello Professor."
I mean, I think it's a valid question that I shave my head.
Yeah, I know you prefer probably comrade to either like Chibber or "Hello Professor," but "Hello Professor." How do we encourage the same increase in productivity with a non-capitalist model? So I think this is a good question. If we were in a socialist society, we would still need to compel ourselves to produce, if only because producing more efficiently means not only more stuff for society, but it also means less time laboring, less time working.
Yeah. So let me say two things. My own view in this is that the left should not be anti-productivity. You want to be in a society where productivity is increasing, with, of course, the ecological and environmental constraints in mind. And I don't think it's the case that zero growth is the only way to save the environment. That's point, and I know that's a controversial topic. I don't want to get into it because it's a whole other thing, so I'll just say it as an assertion right now. First of all, I think we should be pro-productivity, partly for what the reason Bhaskar says. Productivity is the route to less labor time. And I think the fundamental goal, or a fundamental goal of socialism, is to work less, for people to have more free time for themselves. Academics tend to glorify a democratic workplace. Most workplaces suck, and they will always suck. You can democratize it all you want. But at the end of the day, what people really want to do is go out and do other things. And I really do think that's a very important goal. So you want to increase productivity. Now, how will you match the productivity gains of capitalism? I do not believe you will. I don't think it'll be I don't think any socialist economy, whether it's fully planned or whether it's market socialism, will have the productivity increases we've seen in capitalism for a simple reason. The essence of socialism is to take away the principle, produce or die, innovate or die, which is the essence of what a capitalist economy is. All the evils of capitalism come out of the blind pursuit of profit and the blind maximization of productivity. So when you take away that principle, I think it follows that productivity gains will immediately be lower and the slope will be flatter. Okay, so that means then that our main concern will not be how to match the capitalist productivity gains, but simply to keep productivity gains at a level that's consistent with our goals. Those in the rich world, you don't need massive productivity gains anymore. In the global south, you will still need to produce better, higher, faster than they've been doing so far. That's a different story.
Right, and obviously if we're not exposed to the same bouts of crisis and instability as we are within the capitalist economy, that it might be okay to have slower growth as long as it was steady and on an upward trajectory. So I think we should end this before lots of questions are still coming in, but I think it's worth. Okay, actually, let me just address one
we can take a couple more.
Yeah, so one conversation in the YouTube chat is around the question of non-Marxist visions of socialism. One kind of, I guess, broadly, why is the persistence of non-Marxist forms of socialism? Do you think there's anything to be gained from those traditions? And I guess there's one person who wanted the more basic definitional question, which I tried to address myself in the comments, which is just what's a relationship between Marxism and socialism? So if you could get into, I know that's kind of a basic definition.
No, I can give a very short, simple answer to that. So let me start with that question. I think it's a valid question, and then I'll go on to the 100 flowers, let 100 flowers bloom question. But I think the question between the relation between socialism and Marxism is simply this. Socialism gives you your values, your goals, and Marxism tells you how to get there. So everybody on the left should be a socialist. Everybody on the left should want a society in which social domination comes to an end, in which there's no exploitation, in which everybody has a chance to develop their capabilities. And also everybody on the left should see that capitalism is a constraint on them. These, I think, are the minimal. If you don't believe these things, you're not only not a socialist, I think calling yourself a radical is also a mistake. Although most radical today are not anti-capitalist. That's another story about how the intelligentsia killed in intelligent thought in this country. So I think everybody on the left should be a socialist. Whether or not you should be a Marxist again, it comes down to whether the theory is right or wrong. And Marxism is fundamentally an empirical theory. It's a theory of how capitalism works, fundamentally. So that theory is either right or wrong. And that brings us then to the first question you started with, Bob. It's not just that, is there a virtue to there being non-Marxist visions of socialism? It's also, is there a virtue to there being non-Marxist theories of capitalism on the left? And unless you're some kind of weird Stalinist or Lysenko, when it comes to social science, if you believe that any theory could be wrong, then you have to not only tolerate, but actually promote different theoretical viewpoints within the left, Marxist and non-Marxist. Marxism should never have achieved the overwhelming dominance that it had by the 50s and 60s. It did so mainly because, like with the Roman Empire and Christianity, it became a state religion and it was exported into the rest of the world. Marxism should always have been a view that gained its prominence because of the power of the theory. Now, I happen to believe it's by far the most powerful theory the left has, really the only theory the left has. But I think it's the responsibility of every socialist to promote non-Marxist theories, a dialogue between Marxism and non-Marxism. And the whole idea of there's something called revisionism should just be abandoned. There should be one theory that comes out of the contentious and, however, comradely debate between different theories, in which, as long as the left reduces the number of psychos and mental cripples that it has right now, you should be able to get to.
So I guess one way to put it is that we are committed to being socialists. Each and every one of us watching this video can say, my entire life I will be a socialist because I believe in this moral and ethical criticism of this terrible class society we live in.
Yes,
But we
yes.
can't and we shouldn't say we'll be Marxist forever, because Marxism is a framework that we'll have to continue to keep empirically testing and to use as much as it's useful, and then to abandon what's not useful.
Exactly.
So there's one question which is, I think, a good place to end, which is, how do we get from here to there? What do you think?
Oh no, that's lecture 3.
Wait, hold on.
Oh, okay.
Wait, the reason why I didn't jump ahead is because the last part is, what do you think about Eric Olin Wright's last work or his vision? You just wrote the review in Jacobin. I know it takes us kind of off topic, but I just want to know whether you would address like kind of the condensed version of what you think was valuable in the last How to Be an Anti-Capitalist book. What's your criticism? Unless you want to just tell people to read the review, I could remove it from the paywall.
I'll give you a bumper sticker version of it, and then yeah, you should definitely read the review. I think it's his weakest work. What's valuable about it is that he still identifies the being on the left with anti-capitalism. I can't stress this more. If you're not an anti-capitalist, you're not on the left. It's as simple as that. And Eric abides by that. What's less valuable in it, though, is that Eric, while he understands that capitalism is a system that works the way I explained it, the conclusions, his political strategy is so far removed from the way he describes the system that you kind of scratch your head and you wonder what happened. Because what he ends up endorsing at the end is a strategy that's really very consistent with the kind of lifestyle politics, what he calls interstitial politics, in which no particular priority is given to taking on the bosses or to building the power of working people. There's many, many, many roads, he says, that can take you to socialism. And I don't think that's true. I think there's one road and only one road, which is you build up the class power of the working class. There are many roads that can lead you to building up that class power. That's true. But the class power, without it, it's just a fantasy that you'll get to. Forget socialism, even reforms within capitalism, just not going to happen.
Yeah, I think there was a lot of socialists who in the 80s and 90s, even if they didn't abandon the calling themselves a socialist or the goal of socialism, started to see the left as a constellation of different movements. And our goal was to create a movement of movements in which labor would exist as a movement, but there would also be given equal weight to the environmental movement, the anti-racist movement, the feminist movement. So it was all basically seen as collinear instead of some sort of overarching workers' movement that would organize a class and all its struggles.
I would put it differently, Bhaskar. I don't think you can have an anti-racist movement if it's not anti-capitalist. And I don't think there can be a women's movement if it's not anti-capitalist. So I think what happened in the 80s and 90s was the anti-racist movement, the environmental movement became redefined so that it was no longer committed to the interests of poor people of color and poor women. So it really became a movement expressing the concerns and the goals of middle-class people. And I would never say that was an anti-racism. What anti-racism? There was no anti-racism in the night. There were a bunch of individuals doing better for themselves who happened to be women and who happened to be black or brown. These were not anti-racist movements. It's very important for the left to realize that. Don't give them that. Don't let them say that, yeah, we were doing anti-racist work while you were privileged in class. You weren't doing shit. There was no anti-racism in that. What there was anti-discrimination, which is one very small component of anti-racism.
It's 5% of our program.
That's right.
So on Wednesday, we're going to pick it back up at 6 p.m. And on Wednesday, I promise that you'll have those digital copies of the ABCs of Capitalism for those of you wanting. There's another version or older version circulating around the internet. You could also obviously feel free to find and download that, but it has a couple typos and we changed the formatting. So the new version will be better, a little bit easier to read. That will be at 6 p.m. on Wednesday. We'll be talking about how capitalists maintain their power. Despite the constant crises of capitalism, what are the sources of stability in the system that explains its longevity? And then on Friday, we'll get at what Vivek was hinting at, which is how we fight capitalist power and what strategic conclusions should flow from the analysis of today's lecture and the one on Wednesday. Both of them are at 6 p.m. Eastern. Obviously, Vivek put a lot of time into putting together these lectures. All we ask is you check out Catalyst, the journal that he edits. That we're just finishing up our spring edition now. It should be out very soon.
In which the lead article will be on market socialism. One of the arguments for market socialism.
Yes, do you want to tease that article a bit, because it's very interesting.
It's by one of the leading Marxist, or I should say, left economists. Whether he regards himself a Marxist anymore or not, I'm not sure. By John Romer, who wrote a very, very influential book in the mid-90s, laying out a model of market socialism. And what he's doing now is revising that model a bit and endowing it with new assumptions about how individuals might behave differently in a market socialist setting. I think it's a very, obviously, since we're publishing it, I think it's a very interesting article. And Romer is always crystal clear in what he's saying. And the great thing about that is you can know if you disagree or agree with it.
Yeah, and I think especially with the situation we're in on the left, we need to not just be talking about rebuilding our social democratic demands, which of course are important, but we could fall into the other trap of not envisioning some sort of world after capitalism. And
Absolutely.
Obviously, we need to keep that horizon out there, even if we think that day to day, the most important thing right now is rebuilding any semblance of a class-based movement, fighting for the demands we saw embodied by, let's say, the Bernie Sanders campaign. But in addition to checking out Catalyst, which everyone should, and Vivek's writing in Jacobin, please press like and press subscribe to the channel. That's how we reach more people. So hopefully we'll get an even better turnout on Wednesday. But thank you so much for tuning in. And thank you, Vivek, for your time. And we'll see everyone Wednesday at 6 Eastern.
Thank you. Thanks to everyone for coming.